Jesus. So I started pastoring a church in 2011. Started gathering people. It wasn't never really in our plan to pastor a church, but in my heart, when I moved from Redding, California to Calgary, we got pregnant with our first daughter, as I mentioned, and it was a surprise, and we moved to Canada to have the baby for free. Plus, we were, felt like God was shifting us to Calgary. But when I went there, I made a commitment in my heart that whatever church that I went to, we were going to go low and serve the vision of that house. We were going to serve whatever their vision was. And I didn't realize that serving their vision was going to be pastoring a church. I thought I would do evangelism and maybe do some small groups and train and teach and speak at their young adults group every now and then. And then I was there 2 weeks, and the senior leaders came to me and they asked me, "Hey, can you meet us for coffee?" I think they're going to ask me to speak at their gathering, and instead they sit down and say, "Hey, we have a vision to plant 5 churches in 5 years." And the Lord gave us this vision. Instead of putting 200 extra chairs in at a balcony and spending $10 million to do that, we want to plant 5 new churches with $10 million. And we wanted to plant one church with revival DNA. One of our leaders went to Bethel Church and got impacted at their leaders advance. And all of us, we kind of want to take this church in that direction. But this church is an old Pentecostal church, and it had some false prophets come through years ago, and it really damaged their idea of the supernatural. And so we feel if we just shift quickly, it will throw most people overboard. So we're going to take the big ship slowly this way, but we want to plant a church for all those hungry, at the bit people. And we feel like we prayed, and we both got your name to pastor that church. And because they both went separately and got my name, and I barely knew them, I thought maybe God's in this, because I don't know why you would choose me. We've never even hardly had a conversation. And so it took me 6 months to say yes, because when I first got saved, the Lord called me to do missions, and I jokingly but not jokingly said, "God, send me anywhere in the world but Russia." I have nothing against Russia, other than the fact that it's the frozen tundra, and I don't like cold. And I say God has a sense of humor because I forgot to say Canada, and I fall in love with this Canadian girl, and I live in the frozen tundra for 7 years and plant a church there. But I only wanted to be there for like a year or two and then move back to Redding or somewhere and just go to the nations from there. So I start planning this church, and we start gathering people, and God just shows up right away. I think within our first few weeks of gathering, we had 150 people coming into our gathering, which was totally we didn't recognize that. And God was showing up so powerfully in our meetings. People were being healed, and people were like weeping and crying, and I've never felt like this. And anyway, one night I went to bed, and I was troubled before I went to sleep. My wife fell asleep right away, and I could not sleep. And I started having these visions, and in the visions, people were coming to my church, and I saw meetings that I was leading, and all of a sudden, the miracles started breaking out. And the meetings began to grow and grow and grow. And before you knew it, there was these like alpha males and females, these A-type leaders, like people that were leading in the government, and doctors and highly educated theologians, and people that were way more qualified to lead in the natural than I was. And I felt like in that moment, I could not sleep because I'm having these visions of people coming to the gatherings, and they're coming because of the signs and wonders and miracles. But in my spirit, I know that that's actually not what they're looking for. Even though they're coming for the signs and wonders, it's actually not what's going to satisfy them. And all of a sudden, it was as if in this encounter, I became Solomon. I don't know how to describe it. It was as if I was King Solomon, and I was like crying out before the Lord, and I realized how empty I was except that God would fill me. And I was like, God, I'm just so young. I don't have the education. I didn't go to seminary. I went to Redding, California, but I didn't even get to do the school of ministry. God made me work in the paint department in Home Depot instead. Like I'm the most unqualified person to be leading this, and all these people are coming. God, I need wisdom. And I began to cry out for wisdom for the next 2 to 3 hours, just crying out and begging God for wisdom. And it was a sense of like, I felt so empty, but it felt so right. I don't know how to describe that. It felt like yeah, I want to stay in this level of humility for the rest of my life, but it almost felt fleeting in the encounter, like, God, I just want to stay here, because it felt so good to feel so surrendered and dependent upon him, so poor in spirit. And I came out of that encounter, and then the next day, I had a prophet friend of mine who helped me plant the church. The first thing I did, as soon as the Lord confirmed it in my heart that I was supposed to do it, is I went in and I looked for a prophet in Calgary to plant the church with. And it was a young man named Luke Niebergall, and I knew he was a prophet in the office because he wasn't just prophetic, but he was on his own already gathering like 60, 80, 100 people with like just on his own. He started in a house church, and the people were attracted, and all he was doing was teaching people how to hear God's voice and training them in the prophetic. And he would do one every month, and he was not just being prophetic, but he was training and equipping the saints for the work of ministry. And so I asked him to plant the church with me. He felt like it was the Lord, and so he planted the church with me. Fast forward, I have this encounter with wisdom. The next day, he comes up to me. We don't know each other that well yet. And he says, Richie, I don't want you to judge me, but I had an encounter last night, and I felt like the Lord told me to share this with you. So I was watching my nieces and nephews. This is him talking to me. He said, I was watching my nieces and nephews yesterday, and I put them all to bed, and I'm washing the dishes by hand. And as I'm washing the dishes, I hear the voice of a grown man grunt inside of the house. And so my first reaction was to defend, like protect and defend. I'm ready to fight. Like, what is a grown man doing in the house when my nieces and nephews are here to sleep, you know? And so he turns around ready to fight, and as he turns around, he hears the Lord whisper in his ear, Balaam. Like Balaam's donkey, Dan was mentioning it earlier. And he's kind of confused by that, but in that moment, the sheepdog walks from the living room. They have a sheepdog named Suki that walks from the living room into the kitchen. And Luke's saying to himself, this is so weird, but I guess God could speak whatever way he wants to. So he looks at the dog, and he says to the dog, Suki, do you have a word from God for me? Another weird story, since we're telling weird stories today, you know. The dog looks up at him, and the voice of a human man says, signs and wonders will draw the nations, but only wisdom will steward them. This is the night after I'm crying out for wisdom. And then the next week, Bethel Church launches like an 8-month series where all they do is talk about wisdom and Solomon for the next little while. And I found this, this quote from John Paul Jackson that wisdom is knowledge being applied, or the application of knowledge. So knowing something, having an encounter, having an experience, but then knowing how to apply it. And so in the midst of all the crazy stories that we are telling and that we will tell throughout this, and I'm going to share some stuff, some stories that God has placed in my heart to add on to what I did yesterday. I just want to affirm the message. Signs and wonders will draw the nations, but wisdom will steward them. Signs point to something. They're pointing to Jesus. Wonders are there to make us wonder how amazing he is. He's wonderful. And I'm excited about what God is even going to do in this session and then tonight when Kim is ministering. But cry out for wisdom. Pursue wisdom.
Hey, I'm so excited that we're doing the stirring again. I'm going to be with my good friends, Paul Martini and John Prudian. We've done stirrings all over the United States. We've seen countless miracles take place, metal dissolving in people's body, tumors dissolving, people being healed of autoimmune diseases and cancer. We've seen hundreds of people saved, if not thousands of people saved. So many people equipped and trained. You know, the stirring was named by Paul Martini as he was praying and asking the Holy Spirit, what conference do you want me to start? And the Lord says, you know, so many people have done so many and gone to so many conferences and schools. They've got a lot of giftings. They've got a lot of prophetic words. What they need to do is stir up the gift of God that's already been given to them through the laying on of hands. And so the stirring is all about personal ministry. It's about stirring up those giftings. And yes, you'll get more prophetic words. And yes, you'll get a lot of impartation. We've specifically structured the stirrings to have longer times of ministry. So there'll be training, there'll be long worship and long times of ministry just to minister to you and your family. And so I want to invite you to come, be a part of the stirring. Let's get stirred up together and see Jesus get his full reward.